The night in the Afghan mountains carried an eerie silence, the kind of silence that soldiers learned never to trust. Under the pale glow of a waxing moon, the jagged ridges looked like black teeth tearing into the sky. AUS Special Forces. Team, 12 men strong, moved cautiously through the valley floor, boots crunching against loose stones. Their mission was simple in outline, but complex in execution. A reconnaissance sweep to gather intelligence on enemy movement rumored in the region. The valley was narrow, hemmed in by cliffs that rose like towering prison walls. A thin trail wound ahead, forcing the team into a single-file column. Their night vision goggles painted the world in shades of green, revealing scattered boulders and the dried skeletons of thorn bushes. The air was sharp and cold, their breath visible even beneath helmets and gear. Captain Reynolds, the team leader, marched at the front, scanning the horizon. He was a seasoned operator, the kind of man who seemed carved from stone, all discipline, no hesitation. Behind him walked Sergeant Diaz, carrying the squad's radio pack, his eyes flicking nervously to the cliffs. "Something's off," Diaz muttered under his breath. Reynolds gave a small nod. "Stay sharp. This valley's a funnel. If they wanted to hit us, this is where they'd do it." Unbeknownst to the team, high above them, enemy fighters lay in wait. They had been tracking the Americans for hours, setting up firing positions along the ridges. Heavy machine guns were mounted behind rocks, mortar positioned with deadly precision. It was a perfect trap, a kill zone designed to leave no survivors. At first, the sound was subtle, a faint click of metal against stone, carried down on the wind. Then came a flash. The night exploded. Gunfire raked down from the cliffs, tracers streaking like fiery comets. Mortar shells screamed overhead and detonated on the valley floor, sending fireballs and shards of rock spraying in every direction. The ground trembled beneath the assault. Contact left. Contact right. Reynolds roared, diving for cover behind a jagged outcrop. His men scattered, some sliding into shallow depressions, others throwing themselves behind boulders. The air filled with deafening noise, bullets tearing into stone and dirt with merciless force. Specialist Harris, the team's sniper, sprinted toward higher ground, Barrett .50 cal slung over his shoulder. He never made it. A burst of enemy fire caught him in the leg, dropping him hard into the dust. His scream cut through the chaos. "Man down! Harris is hit!" Someone shouted. Sarah Lawson, the combat medic attached to the team, scrambled to Harris's side. Though technically a civilian contractor, she wore the same helmet and vest as the others, her medical pack bouncing against her back as she crawled across the ground. Her heart pounded in her chest, but training guided her hands. She dragged Harris behind a rock and began applying pressure to the bleeding wound, bullets striking dangerously close around them. The team tried to return fire, but they were pinned from every angle. Enemy positions on the cliffs gave them total control of the battlefield. The Americans' rifles barked defiantly into the darkness, but every shot felt like throwing pebbles at a flood. "Where the hell's our support?" Sergeant Diaz yelled into the radio. Static answered him. The signal was jammed. Reynolds cursed under his breath. They were blind, cut off, and surrounded. Another mortar shell crashed down, lifting a soldier off his feet and slamming him into the dirt. Shrapnel peppered the valley floor, the acrid stench of burning powder mixed with dust and blood, choking the lungs of those still fighting. The men had faced combat before, but this was different. This wasn't a firefight. It was an execution. Sarah kept her head low, her hands slick with Harris's blood. Her ears rang from the constant barrage. She wasn't supposed to be here in the line of fire. Medics were meant to patch wounds behind the chaos, not in the middle of it. But here, she was the fragile line between life and death for the man before her. "Stay with me," she whispered to Harris, tightening a tourniquet on his thigh. His face was pale, teeth clenched against the pain. Bullets sparked against the rock inches from her head. She flinched, but didn't stop working. Across the valley, Private Miller cried out as a round grazed his arm. Another soldier pulled him back, blood running down his sleeve. The team was unraveling, every man fighting to survive, every second threatening to be their last. The enemy pressed harder. Shadows shifted on the ridges, fighters maneuvering to tighten the noose. Their voices echoed in the night, confident, mocking, certain that victory was close. Inside the valley, time seemed to slow. Each explosion was a hammer blow, each bullet a reminder that the odds were stacked impossibly high. Captain Reynolds knew they couldn't hold forever. He scanned the terrain, searching desperately for an escape route, but every direction was covered. If they stayed put, they'd be wiped out. If they moved, they'd be cut down in the open. Then his eyes landed on the Barrett .50 cal, lying abandoned near Harris. The weapon was their only chance, the only thing powerful enough to punch through the enemy's fortified positions. Without it, they were trapped rats in a cage. But Harris was down, and no one else dared reach for it under the relentless fire. Reynolds's jaw tightened. The mission was over. The question now was survival, and who, if any, would live to tell the tale. Sarah finished stabilizing Harris, her hands trembling as she wiped sweat and blood from her face. She peeked over. The rock, her stomach tightening at the sight of enemy muzzle, flashes peppering the ridges. The sound of the Barrett's silence gnawed at her. She didn't fully understand its power, but she knew enough. Without that gun, they were doomed. The ambush wasn't just a fight. It was the beginning of a nightmare that would push Sarah beyond the limits of fear, beyond the boundaries of her role, and into a moment where history itself would hinge on her choice. And as the mountains burned with fire and fury, Sarah realized the truth. The special forces were doomed. Unless someone, against all odds, picked up the weapon that could change everything. Sarah Lawson had always known she was different from the men around her. She wasn't forged in the crucible of boot camp or molded through years of battlefield rotations. She hadn't been trained to kill, to clear buildings, or to storm through ambushes with bullets snapping past her ears. Her training had been focused on saving lives, not taking them. She was a healer, a medic, a civilian contractor who had volunteered to serve alongside special forces because she believed her skills could make a difference. But under fire, in the dust-choked valley of Afghanistan, none of that seemed to matter. The soldiers around her were moving with grim efficiency. Captain Reynolds barked orders, his voice sharp and commanding even as mortar thundered in the distance. Sergeant Diaz dragged a wounded man behind cover, his hands steady even, with blood pouring between his fingers. Private Miller fumbled with fresh magazines, his eyes wide with panic, but his body obeying drilled muscle memory. Every one of them was a cog in a well-oiled machine built for war. And then there was Sarah. She crouched low behind a fractured boulder, clutching her medical pack like it was a shield. Her chest heaved, lungs burning with dust and adrenaline. The roar of gunfire echoed all around her, every shot a violent reminder that she did not belong here. She had chosen this path. Yes, but in the moment, it felt less like choice and more like madness. What had she been thinking when she signed up to embed with Special Forces? The first time she met them, months earlier, the soldiers had eyed her with skepticism. Most had served together for years, bonded through unspoken trust built on the battlefield. She was the outsider, the civilian who hadn't been blooded in combat. Some had dismissed her outright, assuming she'd fold under pressure. Others were polite but distant, the way soldiers often were with those who hadn't earned their scars. Now, under fire, Sarah felt the weight of their doubts pressing on her like the cliffs looming above. Her hands shook as she worked on Specialist Harris, who groaned in pain beside her. The sniper's leg was torn open, blood pooling fast. Sarah pressed a bandage into the wound and tightened a tourniquet, whispering words of reassurance she wasn't sure he could hear. Her gloves were slick with blood, but she forced herself to stay calm. Fear could come later. Right now, Harris needed her hands steady. Another mortar exploded nearby, showering them with dirt and fragments of stone. Sarah flinched, but did not stop. Her mind moved with clinical focus, each action automatic. Check airway, control bleeding, keep him conscious. "Stay with me, Harris," she murmured, glancing at his pale face. "You're not done yet. Don't you dare check out on me." Harris grimaced, trying to speak, but his words were drowned out by the staccato chatter of machine guns. Above them, enemy fighters poured relentless fire into the valley. The soldiers returned fire in bursts, but their rifles seemed pitiful against the elevated positions. Sarah could see the tension etched into every face, the grim knowledge that they were fighting uphill against impossible odds. She caught Captain Reynolds's eye for a brief second. His gaze lingered on her longer than necessary, as though weighing something unspoken. She saw in his expression both doubt and something else, perhaps respect, or maybe surprise that she hadn't broken under pressure. She didn't have time to wonder. Bullets cracked against the rock beside her head, sending shards into her cheek. She pressed lower, her heart hammering against her ribs. This wasn't the hospital tent. There were no sterile lights here, no calm voices, no steady hum of machines. This was raw, brutal chaos. And yet, in some strange way, it was also where she felt most alive. "Medic!" A soldier shouted from across the valley. Sarah looked up to see Private Miller clutching his arm, blood streaming through his fingers. He was pinned behind a low rock, barely covered from enemy fire. Sarah's instincts screamed to stay where she was. She was already risking enough by keeping Harris alive. But Miller's voice cut through her hesitation. She couldn't ignore it. That wasn't who she was. "Cover me," she yelled, surprising even herself. Two soldiers laid down suppressing fire, their rifles barking in controlled bursts. Sarah dashed from her cover, keeping low as bullets whizzed overhead. Her boots pounded the rocky ground, every step a gamble against death. She slid beside Miller, dropping her pack and immediately assessing his wound. "It's a graze," she said quickly, her voice firm. "Hurts like hell, but you'll live." Miller laughed shakily, though his eyes betrayed the terror coursing through him. "You're crazy, Doc, running out here like that." "Better crazy than dead," she shot back, wrapping his arm with a bandage. "Now keep firing." She slapped a fresh magazine into his vest and sprinted back toward Harris. Her lungs burned, her ears rang, but she felt something shift inside her. For the first time, she wasn't just the civilian medic tagging along. She was part of this fight. Still, the divide between her and the soldiers was real. They carried rifles. She carried bandages. They fought to kill. She fought to save. But as she knelt once more beside Harris, Sarah realized that the battlefield didn't care about distinctions. Bullets didn't stop for job titles. Mortar didn't discriminate between soldier and medic. In this valley, she was as much a target as anyone else. And maybe, just maybe, she was also as much a fighter. Harris groaned again, his face pale, sweat beading on his forehead. Sarah pressed a syringe into his arm, delivering pain relief. "Hang in there," she whispered. "We'll get you out of this." But even as she said it, a gnawing fear grew inside her. The enemy had them pinned. The radio was useless. Reinforcements weren't coming fast enough. Every passing minute tightened the noose. She glanced at the Barrett .50 cal lying nearby, its long barrel glinting faintly in the moonlight. It was an intimidating sight, a weapon she had only seen fired in training demonstrations. She knew its power, knew it could reach the enemies dug into the cliffs. But Harris, their sniper, was out of the fight, and none of the others seemed willing to abandon their positions to wield it. The rifle looked out of place, silent and useless, while chaos roared around it. And yet, in Sarah's eyes, it seemed almost alive, a dormant beast waiting for someone brave or desperate enough to awaken it. She pushed the thought aside, focusing instead on Harris's breathing. But deep down, something stirred within her, a whisper she tried to ignore. If no one else does it, could I? The idea was absurd. She wasn't trained for that. She was a healer, not a sniper. And yet, the thought lingered, refusing to leave. Around her, the battle raged on. Bullets cracked, mortar thundered. Men shouted, and Sarah Lawson, the civilian among soldiers, began to realize that her role on this battlefield might be far larger than she had ever imagined. She was here to save lives. She just hadn't yet understood all the ways that mission might unfold. The valley had become a furnace of sound and light. Gunfire rained down in relentless bursts, each crack of a Kalashnikov echoing against the cliffs like a drumbeat of death. Tracer rounds stitched glowing arcs across the night, painting the eye, darkness in streaks of red and green. Mortar blasts rocked the ground, shaking dust loose from the cliffs, filling the air with choking clouds that made every breath taste of ash. Sarah Lawson pressed her back against the rock, forcing herself to stay small. Her helmet rang from the constant percussion, her ears buzzing with the metallic hum of too much noise. Fear was no longer an idea. It was alive, a living predator, circling her mind, whispering that every second might be her last. She risked a glance over the boulder. The scene was chaos. Private Miller was firing wildly, his bandaged arm stiff, but his eyes burning with desperation. Sergeant Diaz shouted commands, his voice hoarse as he coordinated suppressing fire. Captain Reynolds crouched behind a slab of stone, his jaw clenched, eyes sharp and calculating, refusing to let despair take root. Around them, muzzle flashes. From the ridges lit up enemy silhouettes, men who moved like shadows, confident and merciless. But what struck Sarah most was the sight of the Barrett .50 cal lying abandoned in the dirt. Its long barrel glistened under the moonlight, black steel, resting useless while the fight raged on. The rifle had always seemed like an untouchable symbol to her, a weapon that belonged to soldiers trained for it, a weapon of impossible power. But now, in the middle of the storm, it was just another piece of metal, silent when they needed its voice the most, and the silence was killing them. Harris groaned beside her, his face pale from blood loss. Sarah checked the tourniquet again, tightening it until he hissed in pain. She forced her voice steady. "Stay with me, Harris. Don't let go." His eyes flicked to the rifle, then to her. He tried to speak, but only managed a weak shake of his head, as if to warn her off. She knew what he was saying without words. Don't even think about it. Another mortar slammed into the valley floor, close enough to send Sarah sprawling over Harris's body, shielding him with her own. Shrapnel hissed past, embedding in the dirt inches from her hand. Her heart hammered against her ribs. She wanted to scream, to let the fear tear free from her chest, but she bit it back. Instead, she focused on her breathing. Inhale, exhale, inhale, exhale. If she lost control now, if she let the panic consume her, Harris would die. Maybe all of them would. Medic. The shout came again, this time from Diaz, one of the younger soldiers, barely out of training, was down with a gash along his scalp. Blood poured down his face, blinding him as he clutched his rifle with trembling hands. Sarah scrambled toward him on her hands and knees, bullets sparking off rocks around her. She slid into position, grabbing his chin and tilting his head back. "Hold still," she commanded, dabbing at the wound with a bandage. He whimpered, his teeth chattering. "You're not dying. It's messy, but you'll be fine. Eyes on me, stay focused." She worked quickly, her hands stained crimson, her body vibrating with fear she refused to show. As she tied off the bandage, she looked up and saw Reynolds staring at the Barrett again. His expression was hard, calculating, but there was no clear solution in his eyes. Without that rifle, their chances of surviving this ambush shrank with every passing second. A burst of machine gun fire ripped overhead, splintering the boulder she knelt behind. She ducked, pulling the soldier lower with her. Her pulse thundered in her ears. And then the thought returned, unbidden, sharp as a blade. If no one else does it, could I? The idea was madness. She had fired rifles before, M4S on the range, basic weapons training, but never under fire, never with a weapon as massive and unforgiving as the Barrett. It was a beast designed for specialists, not medics. The recoil alone could shatter a shoulder if held wrong. And yet, what other choice did they have? She glanced at Harris again. His lips moved, whispering something. She couldn't hear over the gunfire. She leaned close, and this time his words came out in a ragged whisper. "Don't. It'll break you." But as she looked into his fading eyes, she realized something else. He wasn't afraid of her failing. He was afraid of her trying. Sarah sat back against the stone, her hands shaking, her mind spiraling. She could feel fear clawing at her throat, begging her to stay in her place, to keep her head down and focus only on the wounded. That was her role. That was all anyone expected of her. But the battlefield had no patience for roles. "Not tonight, Captain," Diaz shouted, breaking her thoughts. "We can't hold them much longer." Reynolds swore, slamming a fresh magazine into his rifle. His eyes flicked toward the Barrett again, then to Sarah, just for a fraction of a second. He didn't say anything, but the unspoken weight of that glance burned in her chest. Fear surged again, cold and paralyzing. Sarah felt it in her hands, her legs, even in her breath. She was terrified of dying, terrified of letting the men down, terrified of stepping into a role she wasn't meant for. But beneath the fear, something else stirred, anger. Anger at the enemy who saw them as prey. Anger at the hopelessness pressing in on all sides. Anger at herself for believing she couldn't be more than a medic. Another explosion rattled the ground, and Sarah made her choice. She grabbed her medical pack, shoved it into Diaz's hands. "Keep Harris stable," she shouted. "Don't let him slip." Diaz blinked at her, confused. "What the hell are you doing?" But Sarah didn't answer. She crawled toward the Barrett, her body trembling, her heart hammering in her throat. Every movement felt like swimming against a tide of fear, but she didn't stop. The rifle loomed before her, massive, almost alien in its size. She slid in behind it, feeling the cold steel under her hands. For a moment, she just stared through the scope, her breath catching as the ridges came into sharp, terrifying detail. Enemy silhouettes shifted, darting between rocks, preparing to press their assault. Her finger hovered over the trigger. The fear screamed louder than ever, trying to drown her, trying to convince her she didn't belong here. But deep in her chest, something steadier pushed back. She wasn't a soldier. She wasn't a sniper. But she was here. And right now, that had to be enough. Sarah Lawson, a civilian among soldiers, had just made a decision that would change everything. The Barrett lay before her like a coiled predator, long and silent, its barrel glinting in the fractured moonlight. Sarah had seen soldiers train with it before, the way it thundered like a cannon, the way its bullets tore through steel as if it were paper. It was a weapon built for giants, for specialists who spent months learning to tame it. Now it rested in the dust, waiting. Sarah's hands trembled as she reached for it. The metal was cold against her palms, heavy with both weight and meaning. Her arms strained as she dragged it into position, the bipod digging into the rocky soil. It was almost as long as her own body, and awkward to maneuver in the cramped cover she had chosen. Her heart pounded so hard, she thought the others might hear it over the gunfire. "What the hell are you doing?" Diaz shouted from behind his cover, his voice ragged with disbelief. "Trying to keep us alive." Sarah snapped back, her own voice sharper than she intended. Diaz cursed, but didn't stop her. Maybe he realized what she did. They were out of options. Captain Reynolds saw her too. His face was unreadable, but his eyes lingered on her long enough to send a message. "If you're going to do this, do it right." Then he turned back to the fight, barking orders to keep the men firing. Sarah lay flat against the rifle, pressing her cheek to the stock. Her hands felt clumsy as she adjusted the scope. She had seen the Barrett fired only in demonstrations and training exercises. Now, in the middle of a battlefield, with lives depending on her, she had to become something she wasn't. Breathe. Focus. You can do this. The ridges came alive in her scope, the green glow of night vision outlining enemy silhouettes. She saw them crouched behind rocks, rifles flashing, confident in their dominance. They had the high ground, the numbers, the firepower. They thought. The Americans were finished. Her finger hesitated on the trigger. Fear surged again, icy and paralyzing. What if she missed? What if the recoil knocked her out? What if she made herself a target before even landing a shot? Then she remembered. Harris's pale face, his blood soaking into the earth. She remembered Miller's terrified laugh when she bandaged him under fire. She remembered the captain's glance, weighted with a trust he hadn't spoken aloud. And most of all, she remembered the whispers of doubt she'd carried since the day she joined this team. That she was a civilian. That she wasn't built for this world. That she didn't belong here. She pressed her cheek harder against the stock, steadied her breath, and decided, no, chose that she would not let those whispers define her anymore. Sarah Lawson squeezed the trigger. The Barrett thundered like a lightning strike, the recoil slamming into her shoulder so hard it rattled her bones. For a split second, she thought it had broken her. But then, through the scope, she saw it. An enemy fighter on the ridge jerking backward, his weapon clattering from his hands. The silhouette crumpled into the dirt. She had hit him. Silence, just for a heartbeat, spread across the valley. Then another soldier shouted, "Holy hell, she nailed him." Sarah didn't look up. Her fear hadn't vanished, but it had sharpened into something else, focus. She pulled the bolt, chambered another round, and swung the barrel toward a machine gun nest spitting fire into the valley. Inhale, exhale, squeeze. The Barrett roared again, the muzzle flash lighting her face. Through the scope, she saw the gunner's body slam backward, the heavy weapon falling silent. The men around him scattered in panic. Her shoulder screamed in pain, but she ignored it. The rifle bucked like a wild beast, but she wrestled it back. Into position. Her breaths became steady, deliberate, each one tied to the rhythm of firing. The battlefield shifted. Soldiers around her cheered, voices rising with a new surge of hope. Miller shouted, "She's got them on the run." Reynolds barked orders with renewed energy, his tone fierce and commanding. For the first time since the ambush began, the team felt the tide start to turn. But Sarah didn't hear the cheers. She was locked in the scope, Her world narrowed to the dance of silhouettes against the rocks. One by one, she picked her targets. A shadow darting from cover, a muzzle flash betraying a hidden shooter, a mortar crew setting up their next shot. Each trigger pull was thunder, each recoil a punishment, each hit a thread cut from the enemy's advantage. And with each shot, her fear transformed. It was still there, gnawing at the edges, but it no longer controlled her. Instead, it fueled. Her sharpened her. She wasn't fearless. She was something stronger, determined. Minutes blurred into an eternity of fire and smoke. Sarah's shoulder throbbed. Her arms ached, but she refused to let go. She wasn't thinking about herself anymore. She was thinking about Harris breathing behind her, about the soldiers rallying around her, about survival. She was no longer just the civilian medic. She was their lifeline. Another burst of enemy fire raked the valley, pinning down 2 soldiers. Trying to drag a wounded comrade to cover, Sarah shifted the scope, spotted the muzzle flash, and fired. The Barrett kicked, and the enemy shooter went down. The trapped soldiers scrambled back with their comrade, safe because of her. "Nice shot, Doc," someone yelled. Her lips pressed into a thin line. Not a smile, but something close. She didn't have time to bask in praise. She had a job now. One she never expected, but one she refused to abandon. Still, the weight of what she was doing pressed on her. Every squeeze of the trigger was a life taken. She had joined the team to save lives, not end them. But the paradox gnawed at her less with each shot, because she understood the truth of this moment. By ending theirs, she was saving hers. As the minutes stretched, the enemy fire began to falter. They weren't advancing with the same confidence anymore. Their muzzle flashes became fewer, their shouts less frequent. Sarah's presence had shifted the balance. But it wasn't over. Not yet. A deep, guttural boom echoed from the ridge, louder than the rest. Sarah swung her scope in her stomach clenched. The enemy was bringing in a heavier weapon, a recoilless rifle mounted on the rocks. One shot from that, and their fragile cover would shatter. She steadied herself, every nerve in her body alight. Her finger rested on the trigger, her breath shallow, the world shrinking to that single, terrifying target. This was no longer just about survival. This was the moment that would decide whether her choice to pick up the Barrett was enough to save them all. And Sarah Lawson, the medic who had never meant to fight, made her decision clear. She was going to finish what she started. The rifle's weight pressed into Sarah's shoulder like an iron anchor, bruising muscle and bone. Her cheek rested against the cold stock, her breath fogging the scope. The world around her, the deafening gunfire, the shouts of soldiers. The explosions narrowed into a single glowing green, image through the night vision optics. The recoilless rifle on the ridge. 2 enemy fighters worked feverishly to set it into place, their hands steady, their intent lethal. If they fired, the rock that shielded her team would be vaporized. Her finger hovered on the trigger. Inhale, exhale. Don't think, just do. The Barrett thundered, a violent kick slamming into her shoulder and rattling her teeth. The sound wasn't just loud. It was apocalyptic, rolling down the valley like thunder. For a heartbeat, the recoil jarred her body so violently she thought she'd lost control. But when her vision cleared, she saw the first fighter's body sprawled across the rocks, lifeless, the recoilless rifle sliding from his grasp. The second man froze, scrambling for cover. Sarah cycled the bolt with shaking hands, slid the crosshairs over him, and fired again. The rifle bucked, smoke puffing from the barrel. The enemy dropped, his scream cut short by silence. The threat was gone. For the first time since the ambush began, the valley felt different. It was still chaos, still alive with danger, but the balance had shifted. The soldiers around her knew it too. "Holy hell, Doc!" Miller shouted, his voice cracking with disbelief. "She nailed them." Diaz let out a bark of laughter, part relief, part awe. Even Captain Reynolds, stoic as stone, allowed himself a brief nod in her direction before returning to the fight. Sarah didn't hear them. Her ears rang from the blast, the world muffled by a dull roar. Her shoulders screamed in agony, the recoil leaving a bruise that would take weeks to heal. But she ignored it. She chambered another round, her breath ragged but steady enough to aim. Through the scope, the ridges were alive with movement. Enemy silhouettes darted, panicked now, not confident. They had expected the Americans to crumble. Under overwhelming fire, they hadn't expected her. The next target appeared, a machine gunner raking the valley with bursts of fire. Sarah tracked him, her heartbeat slowing as if time itself bent to her focus. She squeezed the trigger. The barrack roared, the recoil a savage blow, but the gunner crumpled backward, the machine gun falling silent. She exhaled sharply, her body trembling, another one down. Around her, the soldiers rallied. Freed from the relentless machine gun fire, they moved with renewed energy. Diaz directed 2 men to drag a wounded comrade to safer cover. Reynolds ordered suppressing fire to push the enemy back. Miller, his arm still bandaged, shouted encouragement between bursts of rifle fire. Sarah stayed locked behind the Barrett. She wasn't thinking about being a civilian anymore, or about what she was supposed to be doing. She was thinking about the next shot, and the one after that. Each pull of the trigger became easier, not because the fear was gone, but because she had learned to live with it. The fear sharpened her, kept her hands steady. She didn't fire wildly. She picked her targets with care. A mortar crew loading their tube, a fighter shouting orders to his comrades, a shadow slipping toward a better vantage point. Each time, the Barrett thundered. Each time, another threat fell. Her shoulder was on fire now, every shot a punishment. Her arms ached from the weight of the rifle, but she didn't let go. Not when the men around her needed her. And with every target she dropped, the soldiers' morale rose. The tide was turning. "Keep it up, Doc," Diaz yelled. "You've got them spooked." Sarah's lips pressed into a thin line. She didn't feel like a hero. She felt like a woman barely holding herself together, firing a weapon too powerful for her frame, clinging to each breath like it might be her last. But if that was what it took to keep them alive, then she would endure it. Through the scope, she saw another figure, an enemy fighter crawling toward the fallen recoilless rifle, desperate to salvage it. Sarah's pulse quickened. She steadied the crosshairs on him, forced herself to breathe slowly, and fired. The Barrett's recoil jolted her hard enough that stars flashed in her vision. But when it cleared, the fighter lay still. The weapon was safe, useless now to their enemies. Sarah exhaled, her breath catching in her throat. She had done it again. But as the minutes dragged on, the weight of what she was doing pressed harder. Every shot she fired was a life ended. Every enemy who fell was another soul she had taken. She had joined this mission to heal, to preserve life. Now she was tearing it away. Her stomach twisted, but she shoved the thought aside. Not now. Later. Survive first. The battle raged on. The enemy was still fierce, still firing from multiple ridges, but their confidence was gone. Sarah could see it in their movements, in the way they hesitated, in the way some of them pulled back. The Americans had been prey. Now they were fighting back. And at the center of that shift was her. She didn't want to think about what it meant, about how the soldiers would see her now, about how she would see herself. She only wanted to keep pulling the trigger until there was no one left to threaten them. Hours seemed to blur into minutes, each shot blending into the next. The rifle's thunder became the rhythm of her existence, its recoil the drumbeat of her resolve. When, at last, a moment of calm settled, a lull in the enemy fire, Sarah lowered her head to the stock, her body trembling from exhaustion. Sweat soaked her collar, her arms quivered, her shoulder throbbed with bruises, but she stayed ready. She had crossed a line tonight. She had gone from healer to fighter, from civilian to soldier, in everything but name. And though part of her recoiled at the thought, another part, the part that had made her crawl to the Barrett, in the first place, knew it was the only reason any of them were still breathing. Captain Reynolds crouched beside her briefly, placing a hand on her arm. His voice was low, calm, steady. "You just saved us, Lawson. Don't stop now." She looked up at him, her eyes burning from sweat and grit. For the first time since she joined the team, there was no skepticism in his gaze, no doubt, only trust. Sarah nodded, turned back to the scope, and chambered another round. The fight wasn't over. The fear still lived inside her, gnawing, whispering. But now she had something stronger to answer it with, the memory of that first shot and the power it gave her to change the course of the night. She wasn't supposed to be here, but she was, and she wasn't leaving without them. The valley had changed. Where minutes earlier the enemy had owned the night, pouring fire from the ridges with merciless confidence, now hesitation bled into their movements. Sarah could see it through the glowing scope. The jerky way some fighters darted from rock to rock, the frantic gestures of commanders trying to rally their men. Fear, once foreign to them, had crept into their bones, and all of it had started with her. The Barrett's thunder had turned the battlefield on. Its head, each booming shot tore holes not just in enemy lines, but in their resolve. The Americans, who had been moments from annihilation, were no longer prey. They were fighting back. Sarah Lawson's body, though, was breaking down. Her shoulder throbbed like it had been struck with a sledgehammer, deep bruising spreading. With every punishing recoil, her arms quivered from the rifle's weight, sweat dripping into her eyes. Her lungs burned, throat raw from grit and smoke. Yet she pressed on, jaw clenched, cheek pressed to the stock. Another silhouette flickered in the scope, a man raising binoculars, likely spotting for mortar fire. Sarah squeezed the trigger. The Barrett kicked. The man dropped, his device tumbling from his hands. "Nice shot, Doc," Miller shouted, his voice cracking with excitement. But Sarah didn't answer. She couldn't let herself bask in their praise. She wasn't sure she deserved it anyway. She just knew that if she stopped now, if she let her exhaustion win, the men depending on her would die. She chambered another round, heart hammering. From the corner of her vision, she saw Diaz crawl closer, his face streaked with dirt and sweat. "You keep this up, and they're gonna think you're one of us." "I'm not," Sarah said hoarsely, her voice barely audible above the chaos. Diaz gave her a quick grin, though his eyes were deadly serious. "Doesn't matter what you think. Tonight, you are." Then he was gone again, shouting commands, dragging a wounded man behind cover. Sarah swallowed hard. Her finger found the trigger again. The fight stretched on like a nightmare that refused to end. The enemy, furious at their mounting losses, pushed harder. Mortar fire rattled the mountainside, bursts of shrapnel kicking up stone and dirt. Tracers streaked the sky like burning comets. But every time the enemy tried to mass together, Sarah found them in her scope. The Barrett thundered, scattering their momentum before it could break over the Americans like a wave. The team responded in kind. Buoyed by her covering fire, the soldiers pushed forward to better positions, laying down coordinated bursts that pinned the enemy. Reynolds shouted orders with iron confidence, his voice cutting through the chaos. Diaz led flanking maneuvers, using Sarah's shots as cover. Even Miller, injured but determined, kept firing his rifle one-handed, yelling curses into the night. It wasn't victory yet, but it wasn't defeat anymore either. Sarah's world narrowed into a blur of targets. And recoil, breath, and pain. Time slipped away. She no longer counted minutes, only the rhythm of her shots. Find the target, steady the scope, pull the trigger, endure the recoil, repeat. Somewhere in that rhythm, she realized she had become something she never thought possible, a cornerstone of the fight. The thought terrified her. She wasn't supposed to be here, wasn't supposed to be the one deciding who lived and who died. But when another enemy machine gun fell silent under her fire, and she saw two of her men scramble to safety in the lull she'd created, she understood something vital. Saving lives didn't always look like she imagined. Sometimes saving her own meant taking theirs. The battlefield bore the proof. The enemy lines, once relentless, now fractured. Fighters abandoned their positions, slipping back into the rocks. Their fire slackened, replaced with scattered bursts instead of coordinated waves. The Americans could feel it. They could taste it. They're breaking. Diaz shouted, his voice carrying above the thunder of rifles. Keep pressure on them, Reynolds barked. Don't let them regroup. Sarah fired again, the barrack bucking savagely into her shoulder. Through the scope, she saw another fighter fall, his comrades scattering. Her chest ached, her throat raw, but she didn't stop. A strange quiet settled over the battlefield, not silence, but the space between collapsing lines. The Americans pressed forward, emboldened. Sarah shifted with them, dragging the heavy rifle across the dirt, setting it back on its bipod, lining up another shot. She felt like her body was on fire, every muscle screaming, but her spirit burned hotter. For the first time, she let herself glance away from the scope, just briefly. She saw the soldiers moving with purpose, no longer shadows clinging to survival, but warriors driving back their attackers. And she realized, I did this. I gave them a chance. The thought nearly brought tears, but she blinked them back. No time for that. Not yet. The enemy tried one last desperate push, rallying a cluster of fighters with heavier weapons. Sarah saw them massing, saw the glint of an RPG tube in the scope. Panic surged through her veins. If that rocket launched, all their gains would vanish. In fire, her body screamed at her to rest, to quit, but she shoved the pain down. She steadied the rifle, lined up the scope, and pulled the trigger. The barrack roared. The RPG man collapsed, the tube falling useless. Sarah chambered again, firing into the cluster. Another fighter fell. The survivors scattered, their push broken before it began. The soldiers around her erupted in cheers, voices raw but fierce. Even Reynolds allowed himself a grim smile. The tide had turned. Sarah collapsed briefly against the stock, her breath ragged. She wanted to let go, to curl into herself and let the exhaustion swallow her. But then Diaz crouched beside her, gripping her shoulder, the uninjured one, and gave her a nod of respect so sharp it nearly undid her. You kept us alive, Lawson, he said simply. Don't forget that. She wanted to argue, to tell him she was just a medic, just someone trying not to fall apart. But she couldn't. Not after what she'd seen. Not after what she'd done. Instead, she looked back through the scope, scanning the ridges for movement. The enemy was retreating now, slipping into the night they had once owned. The valley, though scarred and smoking, belonged to the Americans again. Sarah exhaled slowly, lowering her head to the stock. The fear was still there, whispering. A guilt was there too, clawing at her chest. But stronger than both was something she hadn't felt in years. Certainty. She had chosen to act. And in doing so, she had changed everything. The tide had turned, for the battle and for her. The valley reeked of smoke, blood, and gunpowder. The echoes of gunfire still rolled off the ridges, but they were fading now, broken into desperate, uneven bursts. The enemy had lost its grip. Where once they had pressed confidently down the slopes, now they scattered into the night, slipping between rocks and gullies to vanish into the mountains that had seemed to promise them victory. Sarah Lawson lay prone behind the barret, her cheek pressed against the stock, her body trembling with exhaustion. The weapon was still hot, the barrel smoking faintly, the metal humming like a furnace under her palms. Her shoulder felt like raw meat, the deep bruise pulsing with every heartbeat. Her arms shook so badly, she almost couldn't chamber another round. But she stayed. She scanned the ridges through the scope, ready for the next shadow, the next flash of muzzle fire. Her breath was ragged, shallow, her body begging her to stop. Yet she kept her cheek on the rifle, her finger hovering near the trigger. She wouldn't let herself relax, not yet. It was Captain Reynolds who finally crouched beside her. His voice was firm, but quieter now. The bark of command softened. "They're pulling back, Lawson. You can stand down." She blinked, her eyes burning, not sure if she'd heard him right. "Stand down?" The words croaked out of her throat like gravel. Reynolds gave her a nod, his face still streaked with dirt, but steady as always. "You bought us the time we needed. Reinforcements are on the way. We'll be lifted out before dawn." The relief hit her like a wave she wasn't ready for. Her arms went slack, her body collapsing against the dirt. The barret slipped from her hands, falling to the ground beside her with a heavy thud. For a long moment she just lay there, face pressed into the soil, breathing hard, every muscle in her body screaming. It was Diaz who came next, crouching and giving her a grin, so tired it was more grimace than smile. "Hell of a show, Doc. I'd buy you a drink if we weren't still in the middle of this hellhole." She wanted to laugh, but the sound that came out was closer to a sob. She quickly bit it back, forcing herself upright. "Where's Harris, Miller?" "They're breathing," Diaz said, clapping her lightly on the arm. "Thanks to you." Her chest loosened at the words. Harris? The sniper who had fallen first was alive. Miller, whose laugh had trembled with fear, had survived. The men she had sworn to keep alive hadn't all made it. She knew that, but some had, and that mattered. She sat back, pressing her hand to her throbbing shoulder. The bruise would be ugly, maybe worse than ugly, but she was alive. They were alive. The battlefield quieted further, only the occasional pop of gunfire echoing in the distance. The Americans hunkered down, securing the wounded, reloading weapons, scanning the ridges for stragglers. The adrenaline that had carried them through began to ebb, leaving behind exhaustion and pain. And then, faint at first, but growing, came the sound that lifted every head, the rhythmic thump of rotor blades. Helicopters. A sound cut through the night like salvation itself. The wounded stirred, soldiers raised fists in weary triumph. And for the first time since the ambush began, Sarah allowed herself to believe they might actually survive this. The helicopters swept in low, spotlights cutting through the haze. Dust blasted across the valley as they descended, their rotors pounding the air. The noise was deafening, but to Sarah, it was the sweetest sound she'd ever heard. Reynolds was on his feet immediately, waving signals to the incoming birds. "Move. The wounded first," he shouted. "Let's go, let's go." The soldiers moved quickly despite their exhaustion, lifting stretchers, carrying injured men toward the waiting aircraft. Diaz hauled Harris with another man. Miller staggered forward with his good arm around a comrade's shoulder. The teamwork was seamless, drilled into them by years of discipline. Sarah forced herself upright, swaying as the ground seemed to tilt under her. Her legs were jelly, her shoulders screamed, but she staggered forward to help. She grabbed one end of a stretcher, guiding it toward the helicopter's open bay. The crew inside shouted encouragement, reaching to pull the wounded aboard. When she let go, Her arms nearly gave out. She staggered back, dust whipping into her. Eyes. The roar of the rotors filled her skull, making it hard to think, hard to breathe. Reynolds appeared at her side, gripping her elbow to steady her. His voice cut through the chaos, low but clear. "You did good, Lawson. Better than anyone had a right to expect." She shook her head, tears burning her eyes. "I killed people." "You saved people," he corrected firmly. "Don't lose sight of that." She wanted to argue, to tell him the images of the men falling in her scope would never leave her. But another stretcher came past, another groan of pain from a wounded soldier, and she knew his words were true too. Without her, there would have been more stretchers, more bodies. The last of the wounded were loaded. The able-bodied climbed aboard next, one by one, their boots thudding against the helicopter's ramp. Diaz gave her a quick salute before disappearing. Inside, Miller flashed her a tired grin. "You're one of us now, Doc," he shouted over the noise. Sarah lingered at the edge of the bay, the dust blasting her hair, the chaos swirling around her. She looked back at the valley, the rocks littered with debris, the ridges still smoking, the ground stained with too much blood. It felt unreal, like a nightmare she'd only just begun to wake from. Then Reynolds' hand was on her back, guiding her firmly toward the ramp. Time to go. She climbed aboard, collapsing onto a bench seat as the crew chief slammed the bay door shut. The helicopter lifted, shuddering as it rose into the night sky. The battlefield fell away beneath them, shrinking into a dark scar on the mountainside. Sarah leaned back against the cold metal wall, her whole body trembling. Her shoulder throbbed, her ears rang, her eyes stung from smoke and grit. But above it all was a single overwhelming truth. They had survived. She turned her head, looking at the men packed into the helicopter with her. Harris, pale but alive, resting against Diaz. Miller, grinning weakly despite the bandage wrapped around his arm. Reynolds, stone-faced but steady, his eyes scanning his team with the quiet relief of a man who had expected worse. And then, slowly, their eyes turned to her. There was no mockery now, no doubt about her place among them, just respect. Sarah swallowed hard, her throat tight. She had picked up the Barrett in desperation, certain it would be her end. Instead, it had been her beginning. The helicopter's rotors beat a steady rhythm above, carrying them away from death and into the uncertain dawn. Sarah closed her eyes, the images of the night flashing behind her lids. The first shot, the men falling, the cheer of her team rallying behind her. She didn't know how she would live with all of it, but she knew she would live. And for now, that was enough. The roar of the helicopter faded into silence as Sarah Lawson sat in the recovery tent at the forward operating base. The canvas walls flapped gently with the desert wind, the smell of antiseptic mixing uneasily with the lingering scent of sweat, gunpowder, and burned earth that seemed baked into her skin. She sat on a metal cot, her shoulders slumped, her hands resting limply in her lap. Her right shoulder was swathed in bandages, the bruise from the Barrett spreading in angry shades of purple and black. Every time she moved, pain shot down her arm. A medic, one of the real ones, she thought bitterly, had told her she'd be sore for weeks, maybe longer. She had nodded without speaking, because soreness was the least of it. When she closed her eyes, she saw the scope again. The green glow, the crosshairs settling over a man's chest, the tiny pause before her fingers squeezed the trigger. Then the thunder, the recoil, and the sudden, terrible stillness of a body falling. One shot after another. Faces she would never know, names she would never learn. She had picked up the rifle to save her team. That much she knew. That much everyone reminded her of, over and over, as if repeating it would make the weight easier to carry. but her heart still twisted with the contradiction. She had sworn to preserve life, not take it. The tent flap rustled, and Captain Reynolds stepped inside. He was cleaned up now, though still in his dusty uniform, his posture as sharp as ever. He carried 2 mugs of coffee, steaming in the cool desert night. "Mind if I sit?" he asked. Sarah shrugged, wincing at the movement. "It's your base, Captain." He lowered himself onto the cot opposite her and handed her a mug. She wrapped her hands around it, grateful for the warmth, though her stomach churned at the thought of drinking. For a moment they sat in silence, the night pressing in around them. Then Reynolds spoke, his voice steady but softer than she'd ever heard it. "You saved us, Lawson. You know that, right?" Her laugh was bitter, short. "Funny way of saving." "I can't stop seeing them, Captain. Every shot. Every time I pulled that trigger, I ended a life." He studied her carefully, his expression unreadable. "And how many of your men would have died if you hadn't?" She looked away, her eyes fixed on the dirt floor. "That doesn't make it easier." "No," Reynolds admitted. "It doesn't. It never does. If it ever feels easy, that's when you've lost yourself." His words sank into the silence, heavy and undeniable. She risked a glance at him, searching his face for judgment. But there was none. Just a quiet understanding, the kind that came from carrying his own ghosts. "Listen," he said after a moment. "Courage isn't about loving what you had to do. It's about doing what no one else could when it mattered. That's what you did. You carried the weight for us. That's a hell of a thing, Lawson." Her throat tightened. She wanted to argue, to tell him she wasn't courageous, that she'd been terrified every second, that she hadn't been a soldier but a desperate medic clinging to survival. But part of her knew he was right. She had acted when no one else could, and maybe that counted for something. The tent flap rustled again. Diaz ducked inside, followed by Miller with his arm still bandaged. Both grinned when they saw her. "Doc," Diaz said, shaking his head, "you're a legend already." Words all over the base. The medic who picked up the Barrett and turned the night around. "They'll be telling that story for years." Miller laughed weakly. "They're probably engraving your name on the rifle as we speak," Sarah groaned. "God, no. Don't even joke about that." But despite herself, a small smile tugged at the corner of her lips. The men stayed for a while, trading jokes, retelling moments of the battle with the kind of rough humor soldiers used to keep the darkness at bay. Sarah listened more than she spoke, her smile faint but real. For the first time, she realized, they weren't looking at her as an outsider anymore. Not as a civilian tagging along, not even just as their medic. They were looking at her as one of them. Later, when the others left and the tent fell quiet again, Sarah finally sipped the chew. Coffee. It was bitter, lukewarm, but it steadied her. She leaned back on the cot, staring at the canvas ceiling, and let her thoughts wander. She knew she'd never forget that night. The sights, the sounds, the smells, they were carved into her memory like scars. She would carry them forever. But maybe that was the point. Maybe courage wasn't about walking away unscathed. Maybe it was about learning to carry the scars without letting them consume you. The next weeks passed in a blur. Reports were written, debriefings held. Sarah found herself pulled into rooms she never expected, asked to recount every detail of what had happened. The brass wanted to understand how a civilian medic had held a special forces team together with nothing but grit, fear, and a .50 caliber rifle. She gave them the facts. She didn't embellish, didn't dramatize. She spoke in quiet, measured words. And every time they pressed her about the kills, about how she had managed to land shots with no formal training, she gave the same answer. I didn't have a choice. That, she decided, was the truth. When the team returned stateside, Sarah walked down the tarmac with them. Families waited, flags waved, cameras flashed. Reporters swarmed with questions. Her face appeared in newspapers, in online stories, in whispered conversations at military bases. The medic who saved a special forces team. She hated the attention, but she couldn't deny the pride in the eyes of her comrades when her name was mentioned. Harris, still recovering, told anyone who would listen that he owed his life to her. Miller called her his hero. Even Reynolds, ever the stoic, told a superior officer, "She was the reason I brought my men home." But when Sarah lay awake at night, staring at the ceiling of her small apartment, she didn't think about medals or headlines. She thought about the weight of the Barrett in her hands, the recoil hammering into her shoulder, the moment she chose to pick it up. She thought about the line she had crossed, from healer to fighter, from preserving life to taking it. And though the guilt never left her, neither did the memory of Diaz's words, "Tonight, you are one of us." She wasn't sure yet if she wanted to be one of them. But she knew this. Courage wasn't about the absence of fear. It was about walking into it anyway, about making a choice when the world left you no choice at all. And whether she liked it or not, she had done exactly that. Sarah Lawson's scars weren't on her skin like Harris's, or stitched into muscle like Miller's. They were inside her, invisible but permanent. And maybe that was what made them powerful. Because in the end, she had turned her pain into something that mattered. She had turned fear into resolve, hesitation into action, and despair into hope. And for the soldiers who had fought beside her, she would always be remembered not just as their medic, but as the woman who lifted the Barrett .50 cal and changed the course of the night.